Okay, week three, the 1860 election and secession. Now, the 1860 election would change everything. We know the nominee for the Republican Party would be Abraham Lincoln, but he was actually not the first choice of the party. Because it was essentially regional and most of its moderates had defected to the Constitutional Union Party, there were no ideological divisions per se, but personality conflicts abound. William Seward of New York, who would, of course, have a long history with Lincoln, had long opposed the extension of slavery, but he had also embraced popular sovereignty after Kansas. Many considered him too radical for the presidency, though, and they sought someone more moderate. Now, of course, if you throw a radical candidate into the mix who promises to end slavery right away, you're going to alienate potential voters, both in the middle states as well as some in the north. So, again, they seek a more moderate person. Lincoln was known for his integrity. He had not seriously alienated any Republican factions, so he would win the nomination on the third ballot. It was a contest between many factions, regions, and individuals. Overall, Lincoln and Stephen Douglas would compete for the Northern vote. Republicans were not even allowed on the ballot in the Deep South. Douglas had proclaimed himself the only true national candidate, as the Democrats at this time were the only truly national party. Again, the Republicans were a northern party. They were a regional party. The key issues, of course, would be slavery and sectionalism, particularly the former. Southern moderates worried that a Republican victory would crush their way of life, that it would lead to the economic enslavement of Southern whites and the freedom of Southern blacks. Some Northerners were also trepidatious. The pro-Democrat New York Herald contended that the election of Lincoln would bring hundreds of thousands of slaves to compete with whites for jobs. This would result in, quote, African amalgamation with their fair daughters of Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, and Teutonic races. So here you have a popular New York newspaper stoking the flames and not only focusing on the labor aspect, but also claiming that these African Americans would come up here and try to intermingle with your daughters. This caused great fear among some, and again, kind of shows really the nastiness that we see on, and we'll see this on both sides, but on this particular issue, and this would certainly become a bigger issue, especially as we approach 1864 and its election. But again, this is also an example. We often look, oh, the North was pro-abolition. No, not necessarily. There were many parts in the North that were not for abolition or emancipation, just as in the South there were some who were not pro-slavery. And again, we're going to see this throughout the war. And when you have a popular newspaper like that in New York City, again, it just shows that this was not as clear-cut as one might think. It was not an either-or situation. Now, how did Republicans reply to some of these claims? In moderate fashion, Republicans forged a platform that advocated limits on slavery's expansion, but no specific end to slavery where it existed. It also called for higher tariffs. Now, this would appeal to Northern industrialists, right? Just like the nullification issue, or what led to the nullification issue. And they called for internal improvements and public lands legislation, which would appeal to Westerners. So again, the Republicans are certainly trying to spread out in this way. In the Midwest, they actually attempted to portray themselves as, quote, the white man's party. This would alienate a few abolitionists, but more importantly, it would snag them many votes in the Midwest. It does show a sense of hypocrisy, but again, it also shows a sense of pragmatism. Unfortunate, to be sure, but this was a political step to gain a larger change, if you will. Not justifying those words, of course, but again, pointing out this was part of a larger plan. Now, what about the other parties? Again, the Democrats, the Northern Democrats in specific, would bring out Stephen Douglas, he of the Popular Sovereignty Initiative, but he had no compromise on a plan calling for legal protection of slavery in the territory. Southern Democrats, because of Douglas's lack of will to do this, Southern Democrats from 8 states would walk out of the Democratic Convention. The Democrats would adjourn the convention, call for another in Baltimore, but Southern Democrats would boycott these proceedings as well. Douglas would easily win, and many of these moderates hoped to gain votes from other moderates in the North and South. Now, what about the Southern wing of the Democratic Party? The Southern Democrats would nominate John C. Breckinridge. He vowed support for the Union, but it also called for federal protection of slavery in the territories and guaranteed its preservation where it already existed. The Constitutional Union Party would bring out John Bell. This party was a mishmash of old Whigs, know-nothings, and disaffected Democrats. It sought to perpetuate the politics of compromise and promised to uphold the Constitution, did not take a stand on the sectional controversy, very much, if you will, kicked the can down the road. So again, this is in many ways a regional election. On November 6, 1860, we know Abraham Lincoln would be elected president. He gained an electoral majority. He did not win the popular vote. There's a reason we have an electoral college. This begins what many historians refer to as the Lincolnian era of American government, one which fostered the growth and power of the federal government. We see this later with the progressives. We see it with Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. We see it with Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Lincoln certainly ushered in a whole new era of American political thought and practice. This also represents, concomitantly, the end of Jeffersonian America by these same historians, the era of states' rights above all, which was now passing. This is one thing that worried Southerners. Lincoln never promised to end slavery, nor did he state he would make this a goal during his presidency. But, of course, this focus on federal power would concern them. And when you look at the South Carolina Statement of Secession, you see a few realities. Now, again, a reminder, the Republican Party was created as an anti-slavery party. Lincoln did have moral convictions against slavery, but most importantly, arguably, was that he wanted to stop the spread of slavery into new territories. This led to the fear of political domination by a party that led the government that was against their values and their way of life. There are many nuances to the Southern reaction, what led to the secession of these states. Part of it is the fact that the Republican Party had come into power and it had been predicated on a sense of ending the institution that not only drove the economic lives of many in the South, but also directed the social structure. I touched upon this in week one. This cannot be understated. That slavery was not just something that helped many Southerners make more money. It was a way that they helped to demarcate one's status in society. Now, states' rights are often argued as the reason for the Civil War, and this is true to an extent, but what did it all boil down to? What was each state looking for the right to do? Practice slavery. So you can look at all these different, economic sectionalism, yada, 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 all this, and it's all true, but it all filters down to slavery. Southern states wanted to continue its practice unabated. They wanted no end to its spread into new territories. And as the GNAP essay discussed last week, the North had a fear that the slave power would end the Republic and take over Congress. Concomitantly, those in the South feared again that the North would dominate Congress, and if the Republicans were looking to stop the spread of slavery, and there was still some land to carve into states, this would mean the eventual domination of the anti-slave or free North in both houses of Congress. So one of the questions for week one was, how did territorial expansion play a part in the origins of the Civil War? And this is number 1, 2, and 3 is political power, power in Congress. The balance of the states was necessary for this for the South. Now, for the North, of course, they did not want the South to usurp authority or to take over Congress in that way, but they also sought more of this domination. And again, expansion into these Western states would allow that for a few reasons. Some of them, of course, are northern and they do not have the soil proper. But even in the southern areas that were being expanded into in the West, many recognize that these soils were also not they were not appropriate for the type of items that were being grown in the Deep South. In other words, cotton, rice, indigo, these things which were labor intensive, this would not be transferred over to the South. So there are many, again, and historians look at this in many different ways. There was a recognition that even expanding into the West, even if these states were in the quote unquote South, it did not mean that they could practice the same things that states in the Deep South did. So, getting back to secession, those in the South obviously upset with this Republican victory for different reasons. Criticism rang out from all over. The Republicans were, quote, a party founded on a single sentiment, the hatred of African slavery. Okay, yeah, that's probably true. The New Orleans Delta called representatives, quote, essentially a revolutionary party. McPherson would Agree, right? Southerners increasingly discussed secession. Many Northerners did not feel that they would actually secede. Seward claiming that, quote, the people of the South have too much sense to launch an attempt to ruin the government. So to stave off secession, a few compromises were broached. James Buchanan, he about to be a former president, in his December 3rd, 1860 State of the Union address to Congress proposed 3 constitutional amendments. Recognition of the right of property in slaves in the states where it now exists or may hereafter. Second, duty of protecting this right in all the common territories throughout their territorial existence and until they are admitted as states, whether they are free or not. Third, a like recognition of the right of the master to have his slave who has escaped from one state to another restored and delivered up to him, reinforcing the viability of the fugitive slave law. All state laws defeating this right were to be considered violations of the Constitution and rendered null and void, essentially making the fugitive slave law part of the Constitution. Now, what do you think is the biggest problem with Buchanan's compromise? I would say it wasn't a compromise at all. All 3 of those factors favored Southern states. They favored slave owners. It was not a compromise. And we know Buchanan was a weak leader, and this is another example. A second option was presented by John Crittenden. He had proposed a block of constitutional amendments on December 18th, 1860, which included extending the Missouri Compromise line westward across the continent, forbidding slavery north and protecting slavery to the south of this line, maintaining an interstate slave trade, and requiring federal compensation to slave owners who were unable to recover fugitive slaves from northern states. Some northern businessmen supported more compromise because they feared economic depression if the South seceded. The Senate would defeat this proposal 25-23 on January 16, 1861. That is a close margin. And when we look at the specifics of this, again, just extending that 3630 line, okay, that sounds fine, if you will. It's still kicking the can down the road for the most part. But it also maintained an interstate slave trade, and for some, this was even more important. It required federal compensation to slave owners who were unable to capture their fugitive slaves. So even so, when we go back to Garrison and we think how his group called for an absolute immediate end to slavery with no compensation to slave owners, this, of course, flies in the face of that. The only part of this that's positive is that theoretically that 3630 line will be extended and slavery forbidden north of that. Otherwise, this very much favors the South. Lincoln did not support Crittenden's proposal. It canceled out the Republican Party's central tenet, according to him, which was the exclusion of slavery from the territories. Lincoln said, quote, let there be no compromise on the question of extending slavery. If there be, all our labor is lost and must be done again. John Taylor would provide a third compromise potential at his peace conference, which was composed of delegates from the border South and most of the northern states. This would meet in D.C. in February of 1861. The conference would craft a 7-point proposal, which was quite similar to Crittenden's plan, and it would suffer much the same fate. Republicans were unwilling to abide by any proposition that challenged the party's very reason of existence. But even if it had passed, would seceding states have signed on? Remember, this is in February. This is after we have seen many states secede. And they feared that Republicans would use every means within their power to undermine the institution where it already existed, regardless of these potential agreements. A fourth option, even New York Senator William H. Seward got on board, a Northern abolitionist who sought an end to slavery's expansion. 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration, on March 2, 1861, Seward proposed an amendment to the Constitution in the Senate. Representative Thomas Corwin of Ohio put it forth in the House. This was called the Corwin Amendment. Quote, no amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by laws of said state. This was passed by the 36th Congress, sent to the states for ratification, but only 4 would pass it. And of course, you need state governments to support this as well. It never used the word slavery. The goal, as with the other compromises, was simply to assure seceding states that the federal government would not interfere with slavery. Even Lincoln supported this, quote, holding such a provision to now be implied constitutional law, I have no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. That last word is very important. But even this, when you think about it, Seward, a rabid abolitionist, is proposing an amendment that will state clearly that Congress cannot interfere, that Congress cannot abolish within a state the institution of slavery. It still, again, stinks of favoritism toward the South. But this shows the desperation by many in the North. The fact that somebody like Seward would be willing to compromise, and I think even over-compromise with those in the South to prevent secession, to keep the Union together. And again, some states have already seceded by this time. There is antipathy already, but Seward is still trying to salvage the nation. So let's go back. That was in February. Go back a couple months. December 20th, 1860, South Carolina secedes. They hold their convention to consider secession. Remember, South Carolina has long been a hotbed of dissent against the federal government. Thinking back to nullification. State officials resolved to take action to protect slavery before the newly elected Republican administration could take any action. They decided to cut ties with the United States. Now, the secession statement shows clearly that this was about slavery. Yes, economic sectionalism split the nation. States' rights was an issue that had caused tension from the beginning of the Republic, but at the root of all these issues was slavery. One interesting work by Charles Dew, D-E-W, entitled Apostles of Disunion, Southern Secession Commissioners, and the Causes of the Civil War. Now, Dew analyzes who called for secession, why they did it, and how they did it. These folks were considered fire eaters because of their rabid defense of slavery and the South's way of life. Dew reports that politicians, judges, and community leaders went from state to state, warning of imperiled white safety, of a mixing of the races, and ultimately destruction of Southern life if, quote, black Republicans gained power. They further warned of a race war if Lincoln was elected. Now, here's a term that we have not really discussed yet. McPherson, I'm sure, is already, the idea of a black Republican. Now, this was a pejorative term for Republicans given by fire eaters especially, or the most rabid of slave owners, which was essentially calling them black because of their support of abolition. Again, a pejorative term. And in actuality, many rabid abolitionists actually welcomed the term. They didn't have a problem with it. What Dew shows in his work, though, is the paranoia that had overcome Southern slaveholders. They believed Republicans would terminate slavery, even though they never promised to do this. And even Lincoln recognized he did not have legal recourse to do so, acknowledging as much in his inaugural speech. But still, the paranoia was grand. They used hyperbole to fan the flames of paranoia throughout the South and initiate secession. They worked not only on economic sentiment, but again, social and cultural sentiment. The idea that our whole social structure will be destroyed. The fact that, oh my gosh, African-American men and white women will mix. Again, for them, this was the end of the world, and they wanted to prevent this. So again, they go from state to state in the South at these various conventions, and eventually they succeeded in seceding. Once South Carolina opened the door to secession, other states quickly followed. In January of 1861, delegates convened in Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana and voted to secede. In Texas, secessionists rejected Unionist pleas from Governor Sam Houston and opted to join neighboring Louisiana in rebellion. The Confederacy now held 7 states. February 4th, 1861, delegates from these 7 states met to form the Confederate States of America. They drafted a constitution and ratified it a little over a month later on March 11th, 1861. But it took some convincing. Fire eaters went from state to state warning of imperiled white safety, again, of a mixing of races and destruction by these black Republicans if they gained power. But what did Lincoln specifically state? Again, he did not go into that. Now, the Constitution emphasized, quote, the sovereign and independent character of each state, kind of similar to the Articles, and guaranteed the protection of slavery in any new territories acquired. Tariffs were allowed solely to raise government revenue and prohibited government funding on internal improvements. Now, many of the men who were at this conference were wise. They had already established themselves in the United States Congress or in state offices. They may have been in the military. They were wise. But to vote and agree to prohibit government funding of internal improvements goes against the very nature of government, even for those who espouse limited government. Whether you're a limited government in 1780 or 2020, you always recognize that the state is necessary to protect the people, the police, the military, the fire, etc., as well as infrastructure. That would be these internal improvements. Regardless, we'll move on. In most ways, actually, the Confederate Constitution was identical to that of the United States Constitution. The government was set up almost identical to the United States government. In fact, again, the Constitution was acknowledged as the supreme law in the Confederacy, except in those particular areas where it conflicted with provisions in the Constitution or in the Confederate Constitution. So again, think of that. This is the symbol. This is the way to do it, but we're just going to tweak a few things. And of course, Jefferson Davis would be elected first Confederate president. He was a former U.S. Senator, a war hero in the war with Mexico, and Secretary of War under President Pierce. Still, many Southerners were against secession. Douglas and Bell had taken over 50% of the Southern vote, actually, and each represented compromise. Many large planters stood to suffer economic loss with disunion. In week 1, I talked about the connection between those in the South who were growing cotton and those in the North who are making them into textiles. That's just one such example. But border states had numerous ties with the North and had little investment in cotton, so there's concern among them. Alexander Stephens was one such Southerner. He had represented Georgia in the House before and after the war. He was governor of Georgia and would serve as vice president of the Confederate States of America. He believed the Constitution would act as a safeguard of Southern interests, that checks and balances would render Lincoln, quote, powerless to do any great mischief. He was right. He warned that dissolution of the Union would endanger, quote, this Eden of the world, that instead of becoming gods, we shall become demons, and at no distant commence cutting one another's throats. He urged Southerners to wait for the first act of aggression, to not strike the first blow. We'll get to that next week. Even Davis himself, the president of the Confederacy, was taken back by secession. In his farewell speech as he left Congress, quote, I am sure there is not one of you, whatever sharp discussion there may have been between us, to whom I cannot now say in the presence of God, I wish you well. Of course, hater is a term we've seen over the last few decades. Davis was not a hater. Many of these people were not haters. Simply had a different way of viewing things. And of course, there's some hate directed toward a certain race, but hate in general. And again, for Davis, this recognition that secession itself was a bit tenuous, recognized the problems with it, but still went with his countrymen. Now, to get to one of the articles for this week dealing with secession, Manisha Sinha, what does she say about the political ideology of South Carolina secession, her thesis? And when you approach any kind of article, this is what you, of course, want to do first and foremost, establish the thesis. Know what the author is saying in one sentence, and then how is the author supporting that? She argued secession served as a counter-revolution to the Revolution of 1776. South Carolina's views on slavery and secession were different from other states, even those other seceding states. Look at the verbiage she uses. Seceders on one side, democratic, stability, traditional. The South in general, historians recently have focused on the hold of Republican ideology in antebellum Southern politics. Secession, quote, was a popular movement animated by a white man's love of liberty and equality and suspicious of power and their own enslavement by the Northern tyranny. This theory, of course, deflects attention from racial slavery to political slavery. Sinha addresses that. We'll get to that here in a minute. But how does she say that South Carolina was essentially different? It included more pro-slavery thought, political separatism, which was unmatched in other southern states. That this was not the belief of the masses. This was not some kind of sense of Republican altruism that would include everybody. Sinha points out that in the South, and this is something I've talked about before, that this idea, it was a top-down affair. Power emanated from the top and went down. It was supported by the elites. And similarly, what she points out here is that secession was the same way. Large planters, the larger slaveholders, were the ones who supported this the most. Now, what was the justification? She points out that Southerners believed slavery defended their base, they could defend slavery based on tradition, on history and experience, that it provided and promoted stability, both economically and with regard to social class, which we've touched upon before. Why? Why would African American slavery do this? Because it made poor whites feel that they had a stake in things too. They were not on the bottom rung of the ladder. Again, I talked about this in week 1. So how did South Carolina secessionism jibe with revolutionary thought? Were they Jeffersonians, as many of these other historians have pointed out? Cena says no. The Declaration of Independence claimed universal equality when that is not the case. Democratic revolutions in general led to a questioning of servile labor, actually. Natural rights, or quote, the rights of man, was a bunch of hogwash when they referred to it this way. Man was not born equal and free, but he was born to subjection, according to these Southern thinkers. And equality was necessary for civilization. According to Leonidas Spratt, who was an advocate of the African slave trade, quote, inequality was necessary to man's progress. As Sena points out, ideological distance between the revolutionary generation of Virginia slaveholders and this mid-19th century generation, which belonged to a tide of reaction. She talks about the Carolina Doctrine, which again dealt with nullification, state veto of federal law, state ownership of national territories, the constitutional right to secession, state sovereignty, the Union as a compact among sovereign states. And she points to the origins of secession, and what were these? They were actually created in the North. The Hartford Convention, when Northerners were upset with Jefferson, felt he was accumulating too much power. That was the first time we really hear secession discussed at length. But she points to a change in the 1820s. And this is what sparks this. Again, she points out, she recognizes that many of these earlier slave owners did believe in the rights of man, did support the idea of a republic, whereas this next generation, not so much. Why? A few things. The rise of abolitionism, gradual emancipation plans in the North, which again, they felt would endanger their institution in the South. The Denmark-Vesey conspiracy of 1822, as well as many others. I discussed 3 slave rebellions in week 1. There were many more, of course. And the more these proliferated, the more fear came up in the South. And of course, sectional conflicts over slavery, specifically its expansion with like the Missouri Compromise. So kind of a confluence of all these things, Sena argues, led this generation of slaveholders to change. And she recognizes, again, slavery was the defining and essential element of Southern society. It was sanctioned by the Bible, according to these people, and the right to property, thus the right to slaves. This was not just about race, this was about race and class. Do these white planters and leaders like Calhoun and Kite view all whites as equal? How might this impact their view on blacks as well? Louisa McCord, a pro-slavery essayist, agreed, quote, the assumed position of equality, even in the limited sense which we adopt for white men, is plainly a false one. All white men were included in the aristocracy, but not all whites were equal. I guess let me rephrase that. The aristocracy was made of all white men, but not all white men were in this aristocracy. What McCord points out, what Sena's argument here is that, again, they can claim this belief in republicanism and equality, but they didn't even practice it within their own race. So, again, this gets to her conclusion that it's not just about race, but it was about class as well. Of course, race is the most obvious defining factor, but that was not the only one when it came to this lack of equality. Another example helping to prove equality was not absolute, gender. Natural and, quote, divinely ordained differences of race and sex further provided or further proved the principle of inequality, that it was the basis for all social organization. Now, she also points even to their idea of this majority rule, which was antithetical to the very concept of republicanism. Majority rule or mob rule, those with the most votes are protected, whereas the minority is dismissed. This again is anti-republican. Now we read a few weeks ago McPherson's claim that the Civil War was indeed a revolution. What might we make of these pre-war thoughts and ideas, particularly in contrast to the American Revolution? Again, Sena's claimed that this was a counter-revolution. It was counter to the many principles and the key principles of 1776. This was a counter-revolution of slavery. And according to Sena, why did South Carolina truly secede? Was it fears of white slavery, fears of political slavery? No, it was about, quote, slavery as it existed and as the foundation of Southern identity. Now, this is a quote from Ulrich B. Phillips, one of the largest pro-slavery thinkers even in the 20th century. I guess maybe I shouldn't say pro-slavery, but certainly a defender of the Southern order. He argued that racism was the basis of Southern identity. So again, she recognizes this, and it would continue. South Carolina would justify secession by claiming state sovereignty, again, the dangers of democratic rule, or the republicanism. And again, we see this with the South. This was, in many ways, they contradict themselves because it's about, the majority, but they're also, when they look at it in a national trajectory, of course, then they become Republican because they realize, oh, we need to protect the minority. And when I say Republican there, of course, I mean lowercase r. Capital R would be the party. But their belief in republicanism, that the minority should be protected, that's how they looked at the national government, and they felt that this was failing. So again, this, in their view, justifies secession. One last point in the context of historiography, because when you look at these articles, you need to put them in the larger historiographical context. What have other authors said? Is this a conversation between this author and another author? This is how you really dig into historiography, which is going to be the goal of your midterm and final papers. But Sina argues that secessionists defended their hierarchical social order and thus were inegalitarian and anti-democratic, which again goes against many of the theories of other historians, which I had talked about at the beginning of this discussion, that believe that these Southerners were in fact Republicans, that they did believe in equality, et cetera, et cetera. She points out throughout her article, no, this was not the truth. Most historians have asserted those in the South were sympathetic to liberty and democratic values. In truth, they were not. That is it. 1860 and